April 14, 1943, 25,000 feet above Tunisia. The sky was crystal clear, a deep blue canvas untouched by clouds or mercy. Below, the desert shimmered like broken glass. In the cockpit of a Messerschmitt Bf-109, Oberleutnant Hans Wolf squinted into the sunlight, adjusting his oxygen mask as he scanned the empty horizon. He was calm, confident. This was routine now. Another patrol, another day where the Luftwaffe ruled the sky. Hans had flown over 80 missions. He had survived Stalingrad. He had memorized the rhythm of aerial war, the tension before contact, the short, brutal engagement, the cigarette after landing. To him, the Americans were nothing more than aluminum amateurs. Their bombers were slow. Their fighters were clumsy. Their tactics were predictable. He had seen them panic. He had seen them die. The war, from up here, still felt like it could be won, but today, the sky felt different. There was no radio chatter, no flak bursts in the distance, no engine noise in the wind, just silence. The kind of silence that doesn't calm you, the kind that wraps around your ribs and starts to squeeze. Then he saw it. It appeared not from behind, not above, but from the sun itself. A blur, twin trails, moving fast, unnaturally fast. At first he thought it was a bomber, maybe one of the British mosquitoes they had learned to fear, but as it drew closer, he realized the truth, and his blood turned to ice. The aircraft had two long booms instead of one. Its engines roared in, stereo, and its nose was packed with something. No propeller, no curve, just death. He reached for his stick, instinctively banking right, but it was too late. The first burst came like a lightning strike. A stream of 50 caliber bullets tore through the air in a perfect line. It didn't scatter. It didn't miss. It was as if the aircraft had drawn a line in the sky and erased anything on it. His wingman vanished in an instant, swallowed by fire. Hans dove, hard, but the thing stayed, with him, not above, not behind, with him. This wasn't a chase. It was an execution. In his report, recovered years later from the Luftwaffe archives, Hans wrote only one line about what he saw. It wasn't a plane, it was a hunter. Back at the airfield, silence reigned. The other pilots didn't laugh when he described it. They just looked at each other. No one had ever seen an aircraft like that. No one had ever come back to talk about it. What they had witnessed that day was the arrival of something that should not have existed in 1943. An aircraft that broke the rules, that ignored the laws of range, of altitude, of speed. A machine built by a country that was not supposed to be capable of such precision. Not yet. The P-38 Lightning. To the engineers, it was the embodiment of twin-engine efficiency. To the Americans, it was the promise of long-range dominance. But to the Germans, it was something else entirely. It was prophecy. Because the moment that silhouette entered the battlefield, something shifted. Invisible at first, but permanent. The Luftwaffe was no longer alone. The desert sky that had once echoed with Messerschmitts and Stukas now had a new sound, a deeper roar, a vibration that rolled over the dunes like thunder. The P-38 didn't just fly, it prowled. Its very shape was unnatural to the European eye. Twin tails, streamlined cockpit, central nose armament with no convergence. It didn't look like anything the Germans had trained to fight, and that was the point. This was not evolution, it was disruption. Many Luftwaffe pilots initially dismissed the P-38. American propaganda, they said, a gimmick. Until the kill reports began piling up, until entire bomber formations started returning home, untouched, escorted by silent guardians that moved like ghosts and struck like hammers. Veteran pilots began requesting different patrol zones. Others refused to engage at all unless they had altitude advantage, and even then, cautiously, no longer did. They dived with confidence. Now they scanned the horizon twice, 3 times. They had started to fear the sky. In the briefings, Luftwaffe officers avoided naming the P-38. They called it the Forked One, or simply it, not because they didn't know its name, but because names give things familiarity. And there was nothing familiar about the way this aircraft fought. It was the first time many German pilots realized they weren't facing a temporary threat. This wasn't an Allied push, it was an American arrival. And this arrival had come wrapped in aluminum and fire. Some say the P-38 wasn't even the most maneuverable aircraft, that it didn't outturn a Focke-Wulf 190, that it struggled in the cold. But none of that mattered in 1943, because the message it sent was louder than its engines. We are coming, and we're not coming alone. This was the beginning of the slow erosion, not just of aircraft, but of confidence, of doctrine, of morale. The Luftwaffe still had its aces. It still had experience. But what it lacked was the one thing America had in abundance: industrial inevitability. The skies above Tunisia were just the first tremor. What came after would reshape the entire war. If this kind of storytelling moves you, consider subscribing to the channel and sharing your thoughts in the comments. Your voice helps us keep history alive, one forgotten tale at a time. It did not look right. That was the first thought that crossed the minds of many Luftwaffe pilots when they saw it approaching from a distance. At a glance, it resembled a mistake. Two long booms jutting out from either side, a central pod that looked more like a missile than a cockpit. No traditional tail, no familiar silhouette. It was as if someone had taken apart 3 aircraft and stitched the wrong pieces together. It didn't belong in the sky, but it was there, and it was coming fast. The P-38 Lightning was not born to look elegant. It was born to solve a problem, a terrifying one. In the late 1930s, as the threat of a global war grew, the United States Army Air Corps issued a requirement for a high-altitude, high-speed, long-range interceptor, something capable of climbing fast and diving faster, something that could hit hard and come home. Lockheed answered with an aircraft that ignored convention and leaned into boldness. Led by the legendary engineer Clarence Kelly Johnson and his Skunk Works team, they created something so far ahead of its time that many at the Pentagon weren't sure it would even fly. It flew. In fact, on January 27, 1939, a prototype P-38 shattered the transcontinental speed record, flying from California to New York in just over 7 hours. The country was stunned, the world noticed, and a quiet message echoed through the offices of European intelligence agencies. The Americans are building something serious. Its appearance alone was enough to make enemies hesitate. The twin boom design served multiple purposes: structural rigidity, improved armament placement, and centralized weight distribution. But more than that, it created a visual profile unlike anything else in the war. Luftwaffe pilots started calling it the fork-tailed devil, in part because of its deadly reputation, but also because it looked like something that had clawed its way out of the underworld to claim the skies. What truly made the P-38 terrifying wasn't just how it looked, it was what it carried. Instead of wing-mounted machine guns with convergence zones that required skill and guesswork, the P-38 placed all its weapons directly in the nose. 450 caliber Browning M2 machine guns and a single 20mm Hispano cannon, all aligned, all zeroed. No need to estimate range, no need to wait for convergence. If you had the enemy in your sights, you were already delivering death. This configuration gave the P-38 an unusual advantage in deflection shooting, the art of hitting a moving target while flying at an angle. It simplified a complex challenge and turned average pilots into dangerous ones. For experienced pilots, it turned the P-38 into a scalpel. Its engines, 2 liquid-cooled Allison V1710s, provided redundancy and power. Each engine drove one of the 2 propellers, which spun in opposite directions to cancel out torque and stabilize the aircraft. The result was a smooth, powerful climb and a dive that resembled a falling comet. In the Pacific, pilots loved the way the Lightning could throttle out of danger. In Europe, it became a matter of survival. The P-38 was one of the only American fighters capable of escorting bombers deep into enemy territory before the introduction of the P-51 Mustang. With drop tanks, it could travel over 2,000 miles. That meant it could reach the heart of Axis industry and come back. It could fly above 40,000 feet. At that altitude, many Luftwaffe fighters struggled to perform, but the P-38 remained responsive, fast, lethal. The Germans didn't understand how the Americans had built something so versatile, so adaptable, so dangerous. And the truth was, neither did many Americans. The Lightning was hard to fly in Europe's cold weather. Compressibility at high speeds could cause control lock and fatal dives. It had problems in turn fights against more nimble German aircraft like the Focke-Wulf 190. But the U.S. didn't need the P-38 to turn tighter. They needed it to escort, to strike, to survive. And it did all of that with unrelenting consistency. In the Mediterranean, the P-38 became the nightmare of Axis supply convoys, strafing runs, intercepts, reconnaissance missions, bombing raids. The same aircraft that guarded B-17s over Italy would be seen days later annihilating enemy vehicles in North Africa. And then there was the sound. Those twin engines didn't just roar, they growled, a low, rolling thunder that seemed to scrape the belly of the sky. Ground troops could often identify a Lightning without looking. Pilots, too. One Luftwaffe ace recalled in a post-war interview, "When you heard the twin boom coming at full throttle, you didn't wait to see it. You moved. You prayed. You hoped it wasn't aiming for you. Some P-38 pilots even customized their aircraft with shark teeth or Grim Reaper icons, but they didn't need to. The silhouette alone was enough. By 1943, many Luftwaffe squadrons had standing orders to avoid engaging twin-boom fighters at high altitude unless in superior numbers. They were not to be taken lightly. In the Pacific Theater, the P-38 achieved even more legendary status. It was the aircraft that shot down Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the mastermind of the Pearl Harbor attack, in a daring interception over Bougainville. That mission alone shifted the perception of what American air power could do. It showed that the Lightning wasn't just a defensive escort, it was a tool of strategic precision. At the heart of it all was a simple truth. The P-38 wasn't just a fighter, it was a signal that the United States was no longer experimenting. It was producing, that it was no longer catching up. It was setting the pace. Each time the Lightning roared overhead, it reminded friend and foe alike that the age of the single ace dominating the skies was ending. The war was no longer about the individual. It was about the system, the scale, the industrial rhythm that never slept, and the P-38, with its impossible design and thunderous approach, was the first whisper of that storm. If stories like this ignite your curiosity for the machines and men who changed history, take a second to share your thoughts below and join our growing crew by subscribing. Every comment adds fuel to this mission of remembering what others forgot. In the early days of American involvement in the war, the Luftwaffe saw little to fear. From the hardened airfields of France to the scorched sands of North Africa, German pilots had grown used to domination. They were veterans, honed by years of brutal combat over Poland, France, and the Soviet Union. They flew with confidence, their tactics refined by blood and repetition. To them, the arrival of American pilots was less a threat and more a curiosity. A footnote. They called them green, inexperienced, reckless. The German fighter aces, many with over 100 kills to their name, viewed the Americans as little more than targets. Their tight bomber formations were seen as crude. Their tactics were rigid. Their aircraft, clunky, underpowered, laughably inferior. And when American fighters did appear, they often broke formation, chased too hard, or froze under pressure. The Luftwaffe took notes. They studied the patterns. They adapted, and they kept winning. There is a grim sort of rhythm in air war. One side learns faster, the other pays in wreckage and bodies. For months it was the Americans who paid. In 1942, the 8th Air Force began daylight bombing raids over occupied Europe. The concept was bold. Industrial targets would be hit with precision, under the protection of self-defending formations. Staggered altitude boxes of B-17s and B-24s filled the sky like floating fortresses. The hope was that overlapping fields of fire from their machine guns would be enough to repel German fighters. It was not. Luftwaffe squadrons, especially the experienced JG-26 and JG-2 units in France, tore into the bomber streams. Approaching from above and behind, diving through formation at high speed, they inflicted devastating losses. American bomb groups began returning home with half their aircraft missing. Survivors carried stories of carnage in the clouds. Engines on fire, gunners blown from their stations, radios filled with screams. And still, the bombers came. To the German high command, this stubborn persistence was baffling. It lacked logic. The Americans were throwing metal into the sky without the protection of long-range escort. No Mustang, no Lightning, only short-legged fighters like the P-47 Thunderbolt, which could not reach Berlin. The Luftwaffe dubbed these raids suicidal, and for a time they were right. Pilots on both sides remember the arrogance that floated in the air during those months. German ground crews would line the runways, watching their fighters take off to engage the next wave of bombers, certain they would return victorious. They often did. The kill ratios were staggering, some days 10-1, but that same confidence became blindness. The Luftwaffe had grown accustomed to a static enemy. They did not expect adaptation. They did not anticipate that the Americans were watching, learning, building. Every lost pilot was replaced, every downed plane studied, every raid, no matter how costly, was data. The Americans were not looking for revenge. They were preparing for transformation. In the pilot lounges of the Luftwaffe, jokes about American tactics were common. They called the bomber formations aluminum clouds. Some pilots nicknamed the P-47s flying milk bottles. Big, slow, easy to hit. What they did not see was what was happening behind the scenes. American engineers were solving problems at a rate no other nation could match. Aircraft factories in Detroit and Long Beach were working around the clock. Radar systems were being miniaturized. Fuel efficiency improved. Pilot training accelerated. New tactics were being developed in simulation rooms before ever being tested in combat. And quietly, aircraft like the P-38 began showing up in greater numbers. The Lightning, with its twin engines and massive range, was designed to go where others could not. It could escort bombers far beyond the limits of older fighters. It could climb faster than most German aircraft. And perhaps most importantly, it could survive. German pilots began noticing a shift. Formations they once dove into freely now shot back more effectively. American fighters that used to scatter under pressure began flying smarter. Instead of dogfights, they executed diving attacks, hit and run, zoom and boom. It was coordinated, purposeful, deadly. In one recorded engagement over southern France, a group of P-38s engaged a veteran Luftwaffe squadron that had previously never lost more than one aircraft in a single sortie. That day, they lost 5. The survivors described the attack as surgical. The P-38s came in fast, struck without hesitation, and climbed away before a proper response could even form. The laughter stopped. Some German pilots began requesting alternative assignments. Others adjusted. Tactics, flying higher, approaching at oblique angles, trying anything to regain the advantage. But the Americans kept adapting. The milk bottles had turned into predators. What the Luftwaffe failed to realize until it was too late was that they were not fighting just another air force. They were fighting an industrial organism, one that learned, adjusted, and scaled faster than any opponent in history. The arrogance that once filled Luftwaffe command briefings began to erode, slowly, quietly, but definitively. What began as ridicule had turned into analysis. What had been dismissed now had to be confronted, and in that shift, the air war over Europe began to change shape. If you value untold stories like this one, consider tapping that like button and adding your voice in the comments. Every word from you keeps this mission going and helps others discover the forgotten layers of history. The Mediterranean sun hung low over the horizon, casting long golden streaks across the sea as engines roared to life on dusty Allied airstrips in North Africa. Pilots climbed into cockpits still warm from the day's heat, wiping sweat from their brows as they locked in for missions that would stretch across hundreds of miles and thousands of feet of altitude. Among the aircraft lining those runways stood a machine that had begun to change everything. It was not sleek like the Spitfire, nor as iconic as the B-17, but it had range, resilience, and a bite that was feared from Sicily to the Southern Alps. It was the P-38 Lightning. By 1943, the Lightning had become the spearhead of Allied air operations in the Mediterranean theater. In the skies above Tunisia, over the ridgelines of Sicily, and across the blue expanse of the Adriatic Sea, the P-38 carved a reputation not through elegance but through relentless presence. It flew missions no other aircraft could, missions that stretched the very definition of what a fighter was supposed to be. Long-range escort, photo reconnaissance, ground attack, interception. The Lightning did it all, and it did it with a unique mixture of raw firepower and unbreakable endurance. While other fighters had to turn back or land midway for refueling, the P-38 kept flying. Allied bomber crews called it their guardian angel. To them, it was more than an escort. It was survival. One mission stood out among many. On August 18, 1943, a group of B-24 liberators from the 98th Bomb Group was returning from a brutal bombing raid over the Ploiești oil fields in Romania. Their formation was battered. Flak had torn through multiple aircraft. Fuel was low. And worse, the Luftwaffe was waiting. German fighters began to swarm the weakened formation just as they crossed the Adriatic coastline. But something else was waiting too. From high altitude, a squadron of P-38s dove like hawks, not in scattered groups, not in reckless chaos, but with coordinated precision. They did not chase. They ambushed. The Lightning pilots engaged in a maneuver that would become legend. Boom and zoom. A steep dive into the fray, a blistering burst of fire from nose-mounted guns, and a vertical climb back to safety before the enemy could react. It was not showmanship. It was math, speed, altitude, angle, and above all, timing. Within minutes, the German attack collapsed. Several Focke-Wulfs and Messerschmitts were shot down. The rest, scattered. The bombers limped back to base. Many of them would never forget that moment, when the sky turned into a battlefield and then, just as suddenly, fell silent. This was the new American doctrine. Precision, discipline, no wasted movement. Pilots were trained not to dogfight for glory, but to engage for effect. They were taught that the objective was not domination, but return. The P-38 enabled this. Its speed in a dive exceeded 400 miles per hour. Its high-altitude performance remained stable, while other fighters struggled to breathe. Its turbocharged engines gave it claws where others had wings. But the Lightning was more than just a defensive tool. It could strike and strike hard. In early 1944, P-38s launched a series of ground attack missions along Axis supply lines in northern Italy. With drop tanks and heavy payloads, they became a hybrid force, part fighter, part tactical bomber. Roads were cratered, convoys destroyed, ammunition depots ignited into plumes of fire visible for miles. German officers began referring to certain zones as lightning corridors. These were flight paths, where the P-38 was expected to patrol, and where Axis aircraft and vehicles moved only under the cover of night or not at all. It was air superiority, not declared, but demonstrated. What made this campaign even more devastating for the Axis was the P-38's versatility in reconnaissance. Fitted with high-resolution cameras, the aircraft flew deep into enemy territory, capturing images of bridges, troop positions, and rail networks. It flew alone, often at altitudes above 30,000 feet, with no weapons and no escort. German anti-aircraft crews would fire blindly into the sky, hoping to strike a ghost. The photos it brought back were fed into targeting matrices, enabling bombers to hit precise locations the next day. Few aircraft have ever played so many roles in one theater of war. Even fewer did so with such relentless consistency. And yet, for all its strength, the P-38 demanded much from its pilots. It was heavy, its cockpit visibility was limited in certain angles. Its controls were stiff at high speeds, and compressibility could cause the aircraft to lose control in a dive. There were no shortcuts. The Lightning did not forgive carelessness. But for those who mastered it, the aircraft became a weapon unlike any other. The Luftwaffe, now dealing with multiple fronts and a shrinking pool of veteran pilots, could not afford to lose aircraft to a foe that refused to play by the old rules. The P-38 never stayed to fight for long. It came in like thunder, struck like lightning, and vanished before echoes could catch up. And it left behind more than wreckage. It left confusion. Because to the German command, the appearance of the P-38 in multiple combat roles was not just unexpected, it was a problem of scale. What once required 3 different aircraft now came in the form of one, a fighter that could escort, bomb, scout, and intercept, and be built in factories with an output Germany could not dream of matching. Airfields in North Africa, Corsica, and, later Italy, became hubs of operations. Every dawn brought a new wave of lightnings into the sky. Mission briefings stretched across languages and squadrons. American, British, Free French, and others worked in coordination. The theater had changed, the tide had shifted, and the P-38 was right at the center of it. Even the weather began to bow to its presence. Nicknamed the Glacier Girl, some Lightnings were modified with specialized desing systems and auxiliary fuel tanks to perform missions in extreme cold over the Alps. Where others turned back, the P-38 kept going. By mid-1944, its silhouette was not only familiar, it was feared. The very sight of those twin booms on the horizon sent German convoys scrambling for cover. Italian partisans cheered its passage from mountaintops. Allied forces on the ground learned to look up and smile, and in the minds of those who fought beneath its wings, a quiet truth began to form. This aircraft was not just surviving the war, it was helping shape how it would end. If this journey through forgotten skies made history feel alive again, take a second to share your thoughts in the comments and consider subscribing. Together, we're preserving voices that once echoed over continents. It began with whispers. In Luftwaffe airfields from France to the Balkans, among pilots who once laughed at American machines, a new phrase started to appear in mission briefings. Not in official documents, not on the blackboards, but in quiet conversations and cautious glances. They called it the fork-tailed devil, der Gabelschwanz Teufel. At first it was just a nickname. Soldiers name everything in war. Guns, planes, even the enemy himself. But this name stuck for a reason. Because the P-38 did not just challenge the Luftwaffe's superiority in the air. It challenged their understanding of control. To men who had trained in the doctrines of the great aces of the early war, there was a rhythm to aerial dominance. Altitude meant advantage. Speed meant initiative. Firepower was important, but tactics always prevailed. Then came the P-38, and with it, a level of strategic unpredictability that disrupted the very core of German air operations. Adolf Galland, general of fighters and one of the Luftwaffe's most respected tacticians, reportedly commented after a failed interception over Italy, They come from nowhere. They strike in formation. And when you think they are gone, they are still above you. He was not exaggerating. American Lightning squadrons had adopted tactics that the Luftwaffe was not prepared to face. The P-38s did not dogfight. They descended from high altitude, fired concentrated bursts with nose-mounted guns, and climbed out before the enemy could turn. The Germans called this tactic hit and vanish. The Americans called it boom and zoom. It was warfare by geometry. Engagements were decided by energy retention and altitude management, not by tight turns or prolonged duels, and the P-38 was built for it. Its twin engines gave it the power to dive with terrifying speed. Its turbochargers allowed it to remain lethal at altitudes above 30,000 feet, and its streamlined design helped it regain speed after each strike, creating a rhythm of attack that could not be matched by the older Bf-109s or even the more modern Focke-Wulf 190s. Some Luftwaffe squadrons began altering their patrol routes to avoid known P-38 corridors. Others adjusted altitudes, flying lower or faster in hopes of avoiding ambushes. But it never seemed to matter. The twin tails would appear on the horizon, and then the attack would begin. Veteran German pilots started to voice concern, not just about the aircraft, but about the system behind it, because the Americans were no longer simply throwing machines into the air. They were executing coordinated air superiority campaigns, often spanning hundreds of miles and multiple waves. The P-38 was central to that effort. It was no longer a novelty. It was a keystone. During the campaign in Italy, the Luftwaffe began to feel this shift on a psychological level. Reports from downed German pilots spoke of sudden strikes, of aircraft that seemed to materialize above their formation, of long-range escorts that never left the bomber's side. This last point was crucial. The Luftwaffe's greatest strength had always been timing, waiting until Allied escorts had to turn back, and then ripping into the exposed bombers. But the Lightning changed that. It could fly from North Africa to central Italy and back. It could meet B-17s at their most vulnerable point, and it could defend them with ferocity. The Luftwaffe's window of opportunity was shrinking. Every month it closed a little more, and with every mission, the fork-tailed devil's legend grew. There is a lesser-known account from 1944. During a Luftwaffe officer meeting near Vienna, one colonel reportedly placed a silhouette chart of Allied aircraft on the table and asked the room, "Which one causes you to hesitate?" No one answered. He pointed at the P-38. "This one. This is not a machine, this is a ghost." Fear in war is rarely spoken aloud, but it shows itself in patterns, in evasive behavior, in altered mission planning, in the way pilots grip their flight sticks before takeoff. And the Lightning had begun to do what few aircraft could. It made trained men hesitate. What made the P-38 so effective at instilling fear was not just its performance, but its unpredictability. Some days, it acted as escort. Other days it came in low, strafing convoys with rockets and cannon fire. Sometimes it flew alone, snapping photographs at high altitude, impossible to catch. Other times it arrived in mass formations, leading the way for bombers. It had no pattern, and therefore it had no weak point. For German ground crews, the sight of twin booms approaching from the distance was a signal to brace. For Luftwaffe pilots, it became a mental equation. Do I engage? Do I have altitude? Am I alone? It is easy in retrospect to forget that the air war was not just a mechanical contest. It was emotional, personal. Every pilot carried the memory of lost friends, burned cockpits, flares that never went answered. And when the same silhouette kept appearing over those memories, it became something more than a plane. It became a symbol. The P-38's psychological effect extended beyond the battlefield. German intelligence reports began referencing it more frequently. Diagrams were studied, kill reports analyzed. Even propaganda units tried to downplay its impact. But the frontline soldiers knew the truth. It was not an American myth. It was very real, and it was still out there. By the time 1944 came to a close, the Luftwaffe was exhausted. Fuel shortages, pilot attrition, mechanical breakdowns, and the skies, still filled with the roar of twin Allison engines. For the first time in years, the German fighter command was no longer asking how to win. They were asking how to survive. If these voices from the past stirred something in you, drop your thoughts below and hit subscribe to join a community that remembers not just the weapons of war, but the weight they carried. It was never just about the pilot. That was the myth the Luftwaffe had clung to since 1939, the cult of the ace. Men like Erich Hartmann, Werner Milders, and Adolf Galland had become household names in Germany. symbols of tactical brilliance and sheer instinct. In their cockpits, victory was a matter of split-second decisions and unshakable nerves, and for a time that myth held. The German fighter force, built on discipline and elite training, carved its legacy across the skies of Europe. But the war was changing, and so was the battlefield, because across the Atlantic the Americans were building something else entirely. They were not just creating pilots, they were creating a system. To understand the P-38 Lightning, you have to look beyond the airframe. You have to look at what stood behind it. The design, the factories, the logistics, the fuel, the replacement parts, the engineers. The Lightning was not a masterpiece of instinct, it was a triumph of process. In the late 1930s, as the threat of war loomed, the United States was still viewed by many in Europe as an industrial giant with no military muscle. Its Army Air Corps was small, its aircraft dated, but when Lockheed received the contract for a twin-engine interceptor in 1937, they were not thinking in the language of aces. They were thinking in the language of innovation. Clarence Kelly Johnson, the lead designer of the P-38, was not interested in building a prettier version of the existing fighters. He wanted to build something that broke the rules. Twin booms, a central nacelle, turbocharged engines, a fully concentrated weapons array in the nose. It was ambitious, it was risky, and it worked. But it was not just Lockheed. The United States government had begun reorienting its entire industrial machine toward war. Car factories became airplane factories. Washing machine manufacturers began making ball bearings. Rubber plants shifted to synthetic compounds. And unlike Germany, where central planning and resource scarcity limited production flexibility, the American model allowed for scale at a speed the Axis powers could not match. By the time the P-38 was deployed in numbers in Europe and the Mediterranean, it was already being upgraded in real time. Field reports from pilots were sent back to Lockheed. Engineers. Adjustments were made. Problems with high-altitude control, modified control surfaces, difficulties with cockpit heating, new insulation and improved ventilation, compressibility issues in dives, research into dive recovery flaps. This was not trial and error. It was iteration at scale. Every P-38 that landed brought with it data. Every mission informed the next blueprint. And because the factories were running 24 hours a day, changes that would have taken months in Germany were implemented in weeks in the United States. Meanwhile, German engineers were facing a different reality. They had brilliant minds, but they were constrained by a collapsing economy, dwindling materials, and political interference. The Luftwaffe wanted new fighters. The factories were still struggling to repair old ones. Aluminum was scarce, fuel even more so, and as Allied bombing intensified, entire production lines vanished in smoke. There is a number few talk about. In 1944 alone, the United States produced over 96,000 aircraft. That same year, Germany managed less than a third of that, and of those American aircraft, hundreds were P-38s, each one arriving in theater not just as a machine, but as a message. You can win the dogfight. We will win the war. The Lightning itself embodied this philosophy. Its engines, the Allison V-1710s, were mass-produced but reliable. Its parts were modular, designed for quick replacement. Even its cockpit layout was built for rapid pilot training. Switches and instruments followed a standardized logic that allowed green pilots to transition into the aircraft with minimal downtime. And unlike the Luftwaffe, which relied on the survival of experienced aces to hold its front lines, the Americans built redundancy into their strategy. A lost pilot was a tragedy, but the system would replace him, with training, with machines, with fuel, with a nation that had become a factory of war. This reality hit the German fighter force hard, because while they still had pilots with incredible skill, they no longer had the resources to support them. A Luftwaffe ace could shoot down 5 bombers in a single sortie, but the next day, 20 more would take their place, with fighter escort, and among them, more P-38s. Even the pace of maintenance told the story. A P-38 squadron could replace a damaged engine and have the aircraft back in the air within 48 hours. In some Luftwaffe units, grounded aircraft waited days or even weeks for basic parts. The difference was not just in capability, it was in momentum. In the skies, that momentum became lethal. P-38s flew deeper, escorted longer, survived more damage. Their presence began to shift how the Luftwaffe fought. Instead of hunting, they reacted. Instead of dominating, they avoided. And in the air, nothing is more dangerous than hesitation. The shift was not lost on American pilots. They began to notice that German interceptors were arriving later, engaging in smaller numbers, breaking off sooner. and when they did press an attack, it was often against bombers that were now better defended than ever before. This is how industry becomes strategy. It is not about a single mission. It is about capacity. It is about overwhelming the enemy not with better luck or better men, but with better planning. The P-38 was not flawless. It had its weaknesses, but it kept flying, kept improving, kept arriving, and with each sortie, it carried not just bullets and fuel, it carried the weight of a nation that had made the decision to outlast the storm. If this story gave you a new perspective on the machines that carried history forward, take a moment to drop your thoughts below and join this mission by subscribing. Every voice helps keep the legacy alive, one chapter at a time. He was not supposed to be there, not on a mission, not in that aircraft, not over the coast of occupied France. And yet, on the morning of July 31st, 1944, Antoine de Saint-Exupéry climbed into the cockpit of a stripped-down P-38 Lightning, took a deep breath, and vanished into the sky for the last time. Most people know him as the author of The Little Prince, one of the most beloved books of the 20th century. But before he wrote of foxes and stars, Saint-Exupéry was an aviator, not just in spirit but in flesh. He had flown mail routes over the Sahara, crashed in the Libyan desert, survived wartime reconnaissance flights. He loved flight the way a poet loves silence, and when France fell under occupation, that love turned into duty. Too old to serve as a combat pilot by American standards, too stubborn to stay grounded, Saint-Exupéry pulled strings and called in favors until the Free French Air Force relented. They allowed him to fly limited reconnaissance missions under Allied command. And so, this man of words found himself in the cockpit of one of the most advanced machines of the war. The P-38 Lightning was never designed for comfort, but it was perfect for what Saint-Exupéry needed. High altitude, long range, fast. He flew unarmed. No guns, no wingmen, only cameras. His job was to fly deep into enemy territory and return with the truth, etched onto film. That morning in July, he took off from an airfield in Corsica. His mission was routine on paper. Photographed German troop movements near Annecy, clear skies, calm wind. He told the ground crew he would be back before lunch. He never returned. For decades, his disappearance remained one of the great mysteries of the war. No distress call, no wreckage, no sightings, just absence. Some said he was shot down by a German fighter. Others believed mechanical failure or fuel issues. A few whispered that it was suicide, that the weight of war and exile had finally become too much for the man who once wrote, "What makes the desert beautiful is that somewhere it hides a well." Then, in 1998, a fisherman off the coast of Marseille pulled a silver bracelet from his net. It was bent, covered in salt, but the inscription was still legible. Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. It took years, but eventually parts of a P-38 were recovered from the seabed nearby. Serial numbers confirmed it. It was his aircraft. The mystery, in a way, was over. But the meaning of that flight remains something else entirely. Because Saint-Exupéry was not just another casualty of war. He was a symbol of something deeper. He was an artist inside a machine built for war. He was a dreamer navigating a reality that had lost patience with dreams. And perhaps that is why his story endures. The P-38 was a weapon, efficient, ruthless when needed. But for one man, on one final mission, it became something else. A vessel for silence, for memory, for purpose, beyond strategy. In his writings, Saint-Exupéry often described flight as an act of peace, a place above borders, above hate. The P-38, with its powerful engines and sweeping wings, carried him not into battle, but into the sky he had always belonged to. There is a quiet poetry in that, and also a cruel irony, that a machine designed to deliver destruction was the final resting place of one of literature's great humanists. The soldiers who flew the P-38 knew what it was. They respected its power, but many also understood its burden, because every time they climbed into that cockpit, they weren't just flying for a mission. They were flying above farms, cities, children, families, real lives. Saint-Exupéry understood that better than most, and he carried that understanding with him into the clouds. His death reminded those who followed that the war was not just maps and orders. It was souls, fragile ones, and even the most precise machine could not insulate a pilot from that truth. After his disappearance, some American pilots began painting stars or little princes on their aircraft in tribute, not officially, quietly, as a way to carry him with them, to remember that above the smoke and fire, there was once a man who believed the sky could be something more. In the end, the Lightning was not just a tool of war, it was a stage. And for Saint-Exupéry, it became the final page of a story that began long before takeoff. If this story left a mark on you, take a second to share your thoughts below and consider joining us by subscribing. Together we honor not just the history, but the humanity that flew through it. By late 1944, something had shifted in the air over Europe. Not just the altitude, not just the direction of the front lines, but something deeper, something quieter. Where German fighter pilots once roared into battle with certainty, now there was hesitation. And it started with the sound, a low, rolling thunder that seemed to hum just beyond the horizon, different from the snarl of a Merlin engine or the shriek of a Daimler-Benz, deeper, smoother, heavier. When German ground crews heard that sound, they didn't always look up. They already knew what it was. The fork-tailed silhouette had become part of the sky itself. In some units, they stopped referring to it as the P-38. They just called it the Twin Ghost, because by the time you saw it, it was often too late. It was not just the machine. It was the way it moved, the way it appeared and disappeared. It did not linger. It did not give second chances. It would dive in from the sun, unleash its fire, and vanish into cloud cover or altitude. German pilots began reporting engagements where they never actually saw the enemy clearly. Just flashes of silver, just streaks of vapor. Trails followed by smoke and loss. Veterans began requesting transfer to quieter fronts. Novice pilots thrown into the defense of the Reich were given crash courses on how to identify Allied aircraft, but when shown the P-38's profile, instructors gave different advice. Avoid it. Climb if you can. Never engage one alone. In the skies over Austria and Hungary, Luftwaffe squadrons began diverting missions to avoid known P-38 patrol zones. Commanders redrew flight plans. Transport runs were moved to night hours. The aircraft that once seemed like a strange American experiment had become a strategic obstacle. Even when it was not there, it was. Its reputation preceded it. Part of that reputation came from what it did beyond the dogfights. It was a multi-role machine in the purest sense. It escorted bombers, sure, but it also strafed convoys, dropped bombs on critical supply lines, and conducted deep reconnaissance. It flew alone, in pairs, in formations, and each time it showed up, something German went silent. Rail lines, fuel depots, communication towers. The P-38 became a blunt instrument of American air strategy. It carried not just weapons, but intent. It said to every German unit below, "We know where you are. We know how to get there, and we will not stop." There is a haunting account from the final days of 1944. A small Luftwaffe detachment near Munich had received orders to relocate before an expected Allied bombing campaign. As trucks and supply vehicles began, rolling through a snow-dusted valley, the column paused briefly to regroup. The pause lasted less than 5 minutes. Then the sky cracked open. 2 P-38s came screaming down the valley, hugging terrain, low and fast. No warning, no mercy. Within seconds, the lead truck exploded. Ammunition began cooking off. Flames spread. The P-38s climbed out, circled once like vultures, and vanished. When a recon team returned to the site hours later, they found only twisted steel and scorched uniforms. The valley was silent again. The message had been delivered. What German command could not fully grasp, or could not accept, was that the P-38 was not just a threat. It was a symbol, a reminder that the Reich's skies no longer belonged to the Reich. For every time the Luftwaffe tried to reorganize its fighter response, the Americans responded with scale, and often the P-38 was at the front of that response. It was not the most beautiful aircraft. It was not the most maneuverable, but it had become the one they feared most. There is power in memory, in the way a shape, a sound, or even a shadow can trigger fear. The P-38 had etched itself into the minds of German airmen and ground troops alike. Its twin tails haunted supply officers. Its unmistakable profile haunted pilots. Its silence after a strike haunted survivors. That fear turned into hesitation, and hesitation, in the chaos of war, is death. The fork-tailed devil had done more than destroy aircraft and convoys. It had destroyed confidence. By the winter of 1945, as Allied forces pressed across the Rhine and the Luftwaffe scrambled to defend a shrinking homeland, one thing became clear to those watching from the ground. When the sky was quiet, it was not a sign of peace. It meant the P-38 was already finished. If this chapter of history sparked something in you, take a moment to leave a comment and let your voice echo with ours. And if you believe these forgotten stories matter, consider subscribing. Together, we keep the memory alive, one mission at a time. By the spring of 1945, the sky over Europe had changed forever. What had once been a theater of duels and daring had become something colder, more mechanical, and far more decisive. The Luftwaffe, once the apex predator of the air, had been reduced to fragments, stripped of fuel, starved of parts. Its pilots, many of them barely out of training, faced an enemy that no longer fought for survival, but for inevitability, and above them, the P-38 Lightning still flew. It flew through broken clouds and over shattered cities. It flew past the wreckage of old empires and over the ruins of ambition, and it did so not as a symbol of vengeance, but as a symbol of endurance. It did not arrive with ceremony. It did not announce itself. It simply showed up and finished what it came to do, because the war was no longer about who could turn tighter or shoot straighter. It was about who could last, and the Lightning had lasted. Behind every mission, every strike, every escort run, there was the weight of an industrial force unlike anything the world had ever seen. The P-38 was never the product of one genius or one factory. It was the result of a national decision, a decision to fight the war not just with courage, but with capacity. It embodied the American shift from individual heroism to coordinated power, where the Axis celebrated the lone ace. America mass-produced competence. Where others clung to tradition, America invested in iteration. The P-38 was proof of what happened when machines were not just tools of war, but extensions of strategy. It was built to adapt, and so it did. From escorting bombers across hostile skies to stalking enemy convoys in the Alps, from intercepting fighters over Rome to photographing targets in the Balkans, from opening salvos in North Africa to final strikes over Berlin, it saw everything. It witnessed the rise of a war machine and the slow collapse of another. It crossed continents, broke records, and helped rewrite the doctrine of aerial warfare. It gave birth to legends, it carried poets, it brought home the broken, and in its final acts, it flew not as a prototype or an experiment, but as a veteran. The Germans had called it the fork-tailed devil, a machine to be feared, but by 1945 even fear had faded, because there was no fight left, only reckoning. American forces advanced across Europe with the sky behind them, and the P-38, once a curiosity, once underestimated, now flew above them as a quiet shadow of victory. Its story, like many from this war, is not just about firepower or speed. It is about transformation. What began as a gamble on radical design became a cornerstone of Allied air dominance. What was once doubted became respected, and what was once feared became myth. Because war does not end when the shooting stops. It ends when the machines go quiet, when the last pilot returns, when the final shadow fades. And when that day finally came, the P-38 did not need a parade. It had already done its part. It had spoken in thunder. It had written its legacy in smoke trails and silence. It had helped win a war that changed the world. And for that, it earned its place, not just in history books, but in the hearts of those who believe that innovation, endurance, and sacrifice can change the course of history. To those who flew it, to those who fought against it, and to those who never made it home beneath its wings, we remember you. Thank you for flying through this story with us. If this journey moved you, we invite you to leave your thoughts in the comments below and share this video with someone who values the power of remembering. And if you're ready for another forgotten chapter of history, click the next video on your screen. Until then, this was the tale of the P-38 Lightning. And now, the sky is quiet once again.